Hello ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome back to the studio. I'm back in Florence and it's time for the first video on the new schedule. For the next 2-3 months I will be putting out a new video every week instead of every 2 weeks. So we'll see how it goes. And the first video, which is this video, on this new schedule is PT Part 1. If you want to learn from me how to sculpt or perhaps just support the channel, then check out my Patreon page. There'll be some news there soon as I make some adjustments to the way it works and hopefully improve it. There's a link in the description below, so please check that out. You'll also notice some changes in the video. I've included almost all the footage that was shot for these first 3 days on the project, and I've sped it up a little bit more than usual, so you'll get to see it all here. Important sections will be played back at normal speed, and I'll talk more in general about what I'm doing and considering during these 3 sessions, and it won't always be specific to what is happening on the screen, so keep that in mind please. Let me know what you think about these changes in the comments below, so I can get some feedback. One of the most frequent questions I get is about armatures. Here you can see how my armature looks, more or less. The outside supports are welded rebar and they will enter into the sculpture somewhere on the hips. I'm not entirely sure yet, but somewhere on the hips, on each side. I have a very solid core to my armature that will support the body of my sculpture, and I'll add aluminum armature wire for the arms, legs and head. This leaves these parts flexible so I can make adjustments to where they go if I need to do that. The wire is attached with hose clamps to the main structure, and thin wire is wrapped around the entire thing to support the clay and keep it from sliding off the armature. I use plumber's piping to create the core of the armature. As you can see, I have only one rebar coming up from the horizontal rebar. So I create a more complex construction that will hold the clay better with the plumber's piping. Plumber's piping seems, at least to me, to be hard to find in Italy, and so I ended up bringing mine all the way from Home Depot at Mohegan Lake in New York. So to make sure I save it, I tape up all the threads with electrical tape to keep them from rusting and getting gummed up with clay, saving some money by making sure the pipes are reusable for future projects. And this is how the finished armature looks. So, finally, after much deliberation, we get to add clay to the armature. I start off by covering the solid structure as this can't be moved and my sculpture must function around this solid structure. I have to make sure right from the get-go that no armature will stick out of my sculpture, and this is best solved at this stage. Once it's covered, I start drawing on the surface. I draw a line to represent the tilt of my pelvis and a center line. The center line has to run in the center of the sculpture, obviously, center line. So I make adjustments to my center line at this stage, moving it slightly to the left or to the right to make sure it sits in a place that's close to the middle of my armature support. And that will allow my contours, to clear the internal armature support. It's best to have equal mass on each side of the armature. On poses that lean a lot, this can be quite tricky, and if you misplace the center line, you'll either have to cut your armature or move your contours and your center line later down the road. Or perhaps the clay will weigh so much on one side, it could fall off the armature, which is not fun. So I take a lot of care at this stage to make sure everything is in the right place before moving forward. I do a lot of height checks as well. I've converted a bunch of measurements down from life size to 3/4 life size before the session so I don't waste model time doing it. And I'm making sure that all my heights are pretty much in the right place. Measuring heights is fairly easy, and as long as you keep track of the pose, making sure nothing major changes, you should be fine and nothing should change too much. You know, imagine if he was sitting down, the distance between the pit of his neck and the pelvic points would change, but as long as the pose don't change too much, these should remain fairly consistent. The measurements are essentially just a baseline, a place to start, and later down the line I'll make subtle adjustments based on visual observation. I had already had a session with the model to plot out many of the measurements, and I had thought a whole lot about how the sculpture would fit on my armature. So I knew that the core armature would be shorter than and narrower than his torso, giving me the flexibility to move the shoulders and the armpit of the neck up and down as needed by adjusting the flexible aluminum wire. If your solid armature runs too high and runs into the pit of your neck, you get locked into this height as your minimum height and you won't be flexible. So, should you need to change something, that becomes almost impossible. I think it's important to expect some mistakes, because we all make them, and so I'm prepared for them, making sure that I can always fix things if I need to. What you don't see me doing is using my plumb line and measuring what lines up with what, because I step back when doing it. I always step back to observe, and as you maybe can notice here, I step back from my sculpture a lot. I think I mentioned this in another video, but every piece of clay added should be an answer to a question observed from a distance, and I do my best to adhere to this doctrine as much as possible. I measure with my plumb line, and in this case, the pit of the neck lines up with the middle of his stand leg ankle, and so I position the leg in accordance to where I placed the pit of the neck. I do it this way because the legs are flexible, and where I put the pit of the neck is somewhat dictated by the solid core of my armature. This, together with the center line, establishes my overall gesture. I also take note of where the vertical plumb line runs through the pelvis. Now, this is not an exact measurement by any means, but it shows me if I've placed things correctly. Doing this and coordinating it with my center line, making sure everything works together, gives me the basis for my gesture. Essentially, establishing the internal underlying structure, giving me a balanced figure. If all my heights are pretty good, I'm off to the races, and it's a good start. The center line, by the way, is visually observed from my model, and I use a straight tool to make sure it's the same on my model and on my sculpture. You rarely see it in this footage, but the legs of my sculpture is not reaching all the way down to the wooden base, and this is on purpose. Again, it gives me flexibility in how long the legs end up, and if I make a mistake and the legs end up a little short, I'd rather have the opportunity to extend the legs a little down than to move the entire body up. One is obviously a lot easier than the other. I actually ended up on this sculpture making the legs a few centimeters longer than my model, just to add some grace to the figure. I think it's within reason and not anything absurd, so I think it works well and no one will notice, hopefully. You might have noticed that it's all kind of construction from the inside out. I start out making sure the figure is nicely balanced, meaning the gesture of the center line and the position of the ankle and pit of the neck corresponds well with what my model is doing. Once this is established, I still adjust and struggle to keep track of it. If you don't pay attention to these things, they tend to drift on you, and as you're building, you'll build mistakes into your sculpture. So I'm always conscious of these things, my center line especially, and I'm constantly chasing it. But once I feel that they've been established within reason, which happens fairly quickly, I progress by adding to the contours or the width of my sculpture. Almost right from the beginning, right from the get-go, I consider the contours not only as contours, but as forms. From the front and the back view, I construct them as they appear on my model, underbuilt, meaning slightly more narrow than what they'll end up as, and then I use the side views primarily to connect the front and the back. This sounds somewhat confusing, I know, and I'll make a video further explaining the concept of contours and what I mean by it. Of course, the side views have contours as well, so I have to construct those as well, not only connect the front and the back. If you do not consider the contours as forms, which is what they are, what tends to happen is that they'll end up traveling up and down the body on a straight line, which is very unrealistic and not what happens on the human body. The contours does not only move up and down, but because they are made up of forms, they have to travel back and forth in space at the same time, and they overlap. So I keep this in mind from the beginning. A good example of this could be the side view, where you have the scapula or the shoulder blade, which is the contour of the upper back, but it's not in the middle of the body. So I don't begin by putting a contour in the middle of my body. I use a back view to find more or less where the scapula is in relationship to my center line, and then from my side view I place the contour of the scapula where I've established it to be from the back view. And the same thing goes for example for the buttocks, which obviously is not in the middle of the body, it's on each side, right? So, and everything else is the exact same thing. A lot of the places the contours will end up does not exist in space from the beginning because there's no clay there, right? So I start them off in the direction they need to go, knowing that there will need to be adjustments later on. I always attempt to build things out so that the relationship they have with each other and with themselves, frankly, is perhaps not accurate, not perfectly accurate, but at least moving in the right direction, which is correct enough in the beginning. For example, if the pit of the neck is to the left of the ankle, I put it to the left. Perhaps it's not perfectly accurate right away, but it's heading in the right direction. It's definitely to the left of it, and it's definitely not to the right, so that's a step in the right direction for sure. The same thing goes for contours. They won't be perfect right away, but for example, the bottom of the rib cage is further forward than the muscles below the armpit, the latimus dorsi. And because everything is so underbuilt and narrower than it'll end up in the beginning, it's okay, as long as it's more right than wrong. And I always attempt to do this, build things in the correct relationship with each other from the beginning. The contours obviously also end up deciding the width of my sculpture, and the same thing goes here. I try to build the widths out so that they are in relationship with each other as early as possible, even though I do keep them underbuilt. For example, if the pelvis is the widest part of the contour, I make sure to keep it that way all the time. Or if the widest part of the contour from the back view is the upper back, once I establish that, or once I establish the upper back, I make sure that that is the widest part, and I keep it that way all the time. Which brings me to an important point. Heights are not flexible, so I do my best to get those right, or more or less right, as soon as possible by measuring. Because, it would be a big mistake to make the overall sculpture shorter than what you would intend to and then expect to be able to build out your heights. It doesn't work that way. Widths, however, are very flexible and they're also very hard to measure, and so I build these up very slowly. I start off underbuilt and slowly grow them out. This also allows me to slowly adjust the forms that make up the contours into the right place in space, creating the most exciting contour possible. The only width I really measure is the width of the pelvis, and I stay true to this measurement. It's my original decision, and it's the one thing I'll never change. Even my center line is subject to adjustments as my model moves a little bit, for example, and settles into the pose, but the width of my pelvis always stays the same. Everything is then visually referenced off of the width of the pelvis. I do take some measurements sometimes, usually just to make sure I haven't gone too wide or to double check a thing I'm having some issues with, for example. But if I do everything correctly, I should only need the one measurement. Important to note that I do not add a lot of internal information until I'm starting to approach my overall width. Because of course, without getting close to my overall width, all my internal information will lack the space it needs to fit. And so there really is not too much point to it. I try my best, especially now that I'm paying for my own models, to stay away from doing things that I'll have to change or move later on. So I do it to save time and to save money, to be honest. But I fairly quickly reach something approaching the widths, especially around the pelvic area, and so I don't hold off on internal information for too long, and we'll talk a lot more about internal information in the next episode. To make sure the center line in the front and the back line up, I have a couple of tricks. One is to drag the center line between the legs before the legs are built, and you can do the same thing at the top before the head is built. This hopefully ensures that at the top and the bottom, the center line matches the front and the back. And then it should be a simple matter to follow it visually, following what your model gives you, and they should line up, or be pretty close at least. If they don't line up, then there's a mistake, and you'll have to retrace your steps a little bit. In the back, it's obviously a lot easier to see the center line because usually it will follow down the middle of the back, which is very visually apparent. It's like a trench running down the middle of most people's back. It will be very obvious from the back view that the center line comes out of the pelvis at 90 degrees to the tilt of the pelvis, and their center line will be straight running through the rib cage. Now, in between the bottom of the rib cage and the small section it comes out of the pelvis 90 degrees to the tilt of the pelvis, it's a bit of a free-for-all. And this little section is where the center line, or spine, if you will, which is what the center line represents, this is where it will bend sideways, connecting the sections coming off the pelvis to the section in the ribcage. Because I work from life, all this is observed, and I never try to follow, well, most of the time, I don't try to follow any anatomical guidelines or rules. Only rule I follow, and 99% of the time I observe this as well, is that it's important to always make sure that the center line is straight running through and coming out of the pelvis, and it's running through the ribcage straight. If not, your pelvis will end up taller on one side, or it will get bent or crooked. And the same thing goes for your ribcage. And both of these are serious medical conditions, and if this was the case on your model, it's very likely that they should be having surgery, and they definitely should not be modeling for you. Having my center line this way also makes sure that I keep things symmetrical. And I'll talk more about this in the next video probably, where we'll get more into some of the forms, which is really where this becomes important. Actually, it's important regarding the contours, so I might as well mention it. Angle breaks in your contour will be symmetrical on each sides of the figure 90 degrees to the center line. So if you have an angle break in the contour on one side of the pelvis, I need to look to the other side 90 degrees to the center line and find the same angle break, because it will be there. Because contours are actually made up of forms, most forms are at least partially made up of muscles, and muscles attaches symmetrically on each side of the body. If it's around the pelvis, they attach to the pelvis, and so we follow the center line running through the pelvis. And if it's around the rib cage, they will be attached to the rib cage, and we follow the center line running through the rib cage. Which makes sense to you, I hope. Also, an important thing to note is that I build things out symmetrically as far as width goes. Again, I'm always trying to keep everything in the correct relationship with each other, and if you have a look at most people, the spine, which is what the center line represents, is in the middle of the body, and so we need equal widths on both sides of the center line. Now, this was a pretty dense episode with a lot of information, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. There are several rewards, one of them being the maquette for this very sculpture, so check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share with your friends and family. It helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.